guys do on the Council of Revenues is basically macroeconomics, right? I mean, the microeconomics that has all of these kind of personal behaviors going on, you guys got to look back objectively, say, well, here's what's going on in all even though micro behavior affects it, but it's the big picture.
Yes.
What is the big picture going on in the state of Hawaii's economy? What are some things that we should know about as givens and must?
Well, I think that Paul's picture on the on personal consumption is certainly one of the big pictures, and that's really important because our tax base relies so much on consumption-based taxes. So, for instance, the general excise tax. When we cut back consumption, our general excise tax really feels it, and that's our primary revenue source. The other aspect of this is the visitor industry, and I'm sure Paul will have some slides on that.
Yeah, why don't I illustrate a couple of these things?
Yeah,
the first slide we'll see here has the visitor count on the left-hand side of the slide, and you can see the big drop after Aloha Airlines and ATA shut down a year ago. Now, these numbers have actually stabilized in the last 6 or 8 months, so I think the worst is over for tourism, but you can see from where we're at, it's a long climb out from where we've arrived this last winter. On the right side of the slide, you can see construction commitments, and in this case, I'm adjusting for construction cost inflation. Private construction commitments peaked in about 2005. They declined slowly over a couple of years, primarily because housing was in decline, and then really plummeted with the credit crunch last year. So both in terms of the investment driver in the economy, which is primarily construction, and in terms of our principal export, which is tourism, we've seen a big downward movement, which then transmits, across the local economy. So all consumers are basically...
Paul, you mentioned that we've kind of bottomed out in tourism. Is that a note of optimism that you're giving us here?
Well, it's not falling anymore. I guess it's somewhere between optimism and pessimism, but it's got to stabilize before it comes back up.
Not the beginning of the end, but maybe the end of the beginning.
Why don't you review for us those falls that we have taken, or the hits in revenues that we've taken? Every time you guys have met, people have shuddered and said, oh my God, they're going to come up with another hit in the forecast. You want to review some of those?
Let me illustrate in terms of the components of revenue what's happened. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see general excise tax revenue. And here I have adjusted for inflation. You can see the big decline that occurred after Lehman Brothers collapsed. That's basically the fall of 2008, or the beginning of the fiscal year that's just ending. You can see that decrease is much larger than the decrease in individual income tax withholding, although that's been drifting downward. And then if you subtract those two pieces from the general fund, what's left over, which I've lumped together here as other revenue components, that thing's dropped a huge amount. It's on the order of magnitude of hundreds of millions of dollars on a year-over-year basis if you compare the first 3 quarters of this fiscal year to the prior fiscal year.
Huge.
It's just a huge decline. And this is where the cyclical part of the economy really comes in, the real estate industry, the
conveyance tax, corporate income tax, transient accommodation tax, all of those.
You're tempting me to say, is this the time we should increase the conveyance tax? We should increase the hotel room tax? Now, I know you guys don't get involved in politics, but there's some of us who would say when it's down and they're injured and they're hurt, it's not a time to pile on with more taxes. But
and since I'm here as part of the Council on Revenues, it's something I really don't want to get into. But I will note that the conveyance tax was increased relatively recently. I can't remember exactly when, but it was increased
to the present crisis.
A couple of years ago. There was some increase in the conveyance tax.
I too will stand back from the policy recommendation.
I didn't want to bait you guys, but
well, we try to observe a protocol on the Council of not engaging in those debates as much as possible. I will make one observation that if you look back at the legacy of tax cuts and tax credits that have been enacted over the years, no one in particular, but the cumulative pattern of those tax changes in the past is that the economy doesn't seem to be able to generate the kind of revenue on the way up, and then it fell away very hard this time on the way down. So this is probably not the moment to rethink those tax changes because the system is so fragile. But there are tax review commissions that have met periodically and have made recommendations, and I think it would be very fruitful, in the next 3 to 5 years for the legislature to come back to a re-examination of what kind of a tax structure
the dynamic macroeconomics. But is it true then we've got almost 2.75 billion in shortfall in terms of what your graph ended up in terms of dollar amount, in terms of state?
Well, it depends on
government
that
funding?
depends on what kind of time period you're talking about.
Right.
But we're on an annual basis. Fiscal 09 is going to be down 400 million compared to fiscal 08 in terms of general fund tax revenues, 400 million. But first of all, that's not all the revenues, and secondly, we're down to $4.2 billion, and the forecast for fiscal 09 initially was higher than 4.6 billion. So that's where some of these $600 million numbers on an annual basis are coming from. And if you multiply those numbers by a number of years into the future, then you're talking about this
The 2-point-something billion.
large
Right.
2-point-something
Right.
billion dollar.
It's a lot bigger in the general fund revenue forecast error than is the norm because of what's happened in the last 12 months to the economy. But there are other moving parts that aren't just in the general fund. And I'm never sure how those budget numbers come up. I mean, I'm sure we can trust them. You can take them at face value if Georgina Wan at the Department of Budget and Finance says, pencil it out. I'm sure it's correct.
Is the system that we have in place with the Council of Revenues, the moving parts of it, when you give the forecast, when we're doing the budget, when you do another forecast, is there a better timing? I know some of my colleagues had mentioned that it would be nice if we knew ahead of time and then maybe right before rather than having to wait till after.
Well,
is adjustments?
Our first general fund forecast number comes out in September, right? Well, I mean, actually, we're doing forecasts multi-years into the future. For instance, so we have forecasts
Every
that
quarter,
we've made
right?
until 2015 already. So
Well,
we have
forecast for multiple years, multiple
You got a
times
graph? You got a graph
this
on
year.
that one? Can you show
No,
the
I
people
actually
that
don't have
you
that
got to
graph.
have some optimism in that one, right?
Well, I mean, we're looking at a return to 4.6 billion in fiscal 2012.
That's just the general fund. There's
That's just the
another
general fund.
5 billion or so in special and other funds.
Okay.
Right. So general fund tax revenues, we're going to be back to where we were in fiscal 2008 by fiscal 2012 is our forecast. So that's basically a 4-year drought period that we're talking about.
Not famine, just drought.
Well, it depends on.
Well, what do you mean
It
by
depends
what?
on how long your furlough is or something like that.
For those who are watching and wanted to make sense out of how we interface with the legislature and you guys, what are some of the street language things that you would say for people who want to see how I called you guys the Federal Reserve. Everybody knows the Federal Reserve. They control the amount of money in the economy. You guys control the amount of money in the budget. It's in
No, we
those.
don't. No, we
It's a
don't.
very, very different kind of
Very indirectly, of course.
We don't control it. We happen to report the news on this.
Your
sort of-
forecast
we're the
becomes
messengers. Right.
becomes the statutory limits, right?
Right. And
Yes and no. There is historical precedent, and there is language in the statute allowing the governor to disavow the forecast. It's happened before, and come up with his, or in this case, her own forecast. And this is important because it goes back to your earlier question about the timing of the forecast. My general answer is the timing of the forecast is in the statute, so the law actually dictates when we make a forecast. As you know, we have this year, because of the turbulence in the economy, we've been asked several times to meet additionally on had additional meetings to the ones that were required because things were moving so fast. And that makes perfect sense, although it's kind of pilikia because at the end of the day, the forecast is not going to change that much from one month to the next. You see what I mean? But things were moving very rapidly, and they did change a lot over the course of the 12 months. So I get it. It made sense.